welcome to Season 7, Episode 7 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Peter Kreeft's A Refutation of Moral Relativism, Interviews with an Absolutist. This time talking about Interview 7, which is we're continuing the last couple episodes when the relativist is now giving her reasons for why she's a relativist, and the absolutist character is then refuting them all in turn here. So very much keeping with the last few chapters where he kind of just demolishes her, I think. But I don't know, maybe you have other thoughts, but I think it was just pretty cut and dry the way the author writes these two characters.
Well, yeah, I mean, the author has the benefit of being able to put words in their mouths.
Yes, that's true.
So you can facilitate a one-sided debate, but the author does a great job of kind of fleshing out both sides of this argument, and it's in the form of the character Libby making arguments on, I guess, 4 through 8, right?
Mm-hmm.
For
5 through 8, I think.
I'm sorry, 5 through 8.
So four total arguments, yeah.
Yes. Which a couple of them are kind of glommed together or whatever. And the point of this debate, but does a good job of making a brief case for them, and then Isa character does a very efficient refutation of the 4 arguments. The first 2 are kind of together, basically situational ethics, that morality is relative. And so the first one is that, there's changing situations. So any particular situation that you're in that has a moral question to it is going to be relative to that situation. So you can't have a rule that applies to every situation. So
she uses the example, thou shalt not kill. And she's like, well, what about just war? What if, there's a really dangerous threat and you have to take that person out and stuff like that? And it's like, I hear that all the time. It's like, well, you can't have absolute rules because there's always exceptions. And that's really what she's saying here. No matter what, the situation will be different. You can't have a rule for every single situation.
Yes. And so that's really, it can be on the surface a very compelling argument. It's like, how do you really say that you have certain standards that apply to everything if every situation has to be unique, but he does a good job, and he doesn't rely upon, I mean, so like, and then the second argument is that your own personal intentions are going to be relative to what your beliefs are and what your views are and how you perceive it and your motives. So your motives are going to vary from each situation. So both of these arguments are kind of taken together. But what I really like is like on page 103 is that Isa restates her first argument very quickly and very succinctly, where he says, so your argument is that morality is determined by situations, and situations are relative and changing. Therefore, morality is relative and changing. And I think that's a perfect synopsis of moral relativism. This argument for it is that, well, every situation is different, so it's always going to be changing. And then he summarizes the second phase of it, which is very similar, same page, a couple paragraphs later. So your argument is that morality is determined by motive, and motive is relative to the individual. Therefore, morality is relative to the individual. And she says, right. That's really, and I think that's the most common sense, and I think probably the most effective argument for moral relativism. How do you have these rules from on high or from some God or from some sort of higher authority that apply to everything when every situation is admittedly different, and your motives are going to change from time to time based upon the situation and how you perceive the situation? So I think that is a fair statement of her argument. And then he basically, he doesn't make the argument, which I think he did in the previous chapter, where is basically your morality is kind of like the laws of physics that apply to all situations. There's certain ground rules, but that's really the argument that he's making, because she's saying, well, your motives change, and morality is relative twice to situations and to motives. And he says, well, no, that's not true. I mean, you have a certain moral belief system that you necessarily have to apply to different situations. That's the whole idea of having a standard belief. And he talks about the 10 Commandments and does a good job of saying, well, really, there are 3 kinds of commandments. Say you can't do things, what to do, and then there are things about what you should do. And then there are certain things about practical things about, how to handle certain particular types of situations, and you apply those as a
Hmm.
general rule to the specifics. And just because you have a general rule doesn't mean that your morality is
Yeah.
relative. Is your morality is the same, but you have to
Hmm.
apply it to the specifics. It's like driving down a road.
Yeah.
You have to drive down the road, but there's all these different variables of different traffic control signals and different vehicles and what other people might do, and you have to apply those general rules to the specific, and that doesn't make
Hmm.
driving relative. You could be a relatively good driver or a relatively bad driver,
Hmm.
similar to be a relatively good person or a relatively bad person, depending on how you conduct yourself morally when you apply the rules of the road, so to speak, to
Yeah.
these decisions. And I think you did a really good job of refuting that it's but then anyway, I don't know if I'm kind of going on a ramble
That's all
there.
right.
You want to kind of jump in, but they did have an interesting discussion, which I didn't think was as strong, where he's talking about, it's where she mentions, it's a balancing act. These different factors that you have to consider, and it's
Hmm.
an art, not a science.
Yeah, I
Making these
like
moral.
that too. Because I like what they say there. 'Cause I think a lot of people, in the way he gives, the Libby character a lot, is that they view absolutism as very simple. It's like,
Mhm.
just a series of do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. We talked about that in the past with people are like, that's why I'm not religious anymore, because it's just a series of, cut and dry rules.
Right.
But, I like what he says because he agrees that it is a juggling act. If you have three different things, both your intentions, the act itself, and yeah, what was the other one? So the command is about
Motive.
intentions, what intentions to have, yeah, motive, situations, and how to apply the rules to different situations.
You have to
Um,
do the right thing, do the right
mhm,
thing, the act itself of what
mhm,
you're doing, and the right motive. Those are the
yes,
three pillars as he describes it.
yes. But I like what he says is like, yes, you do have to juggle all of those, but there are rules for each of them. So it's not like one suddenly takes priority over the others and makes the other two like ineffective or don't matter. It's that you have to apply all three. You have to check all three boxes for an act to be good, right? It's not that, your intention, even if the act is bad, suddenly makes a bad act good. The bad act is still bad. For something to be good, it has to meet all three.
Right. And then he pushes that into making her examine her own beliefs, where he talks about, well, okay, as far as there's some things that are just absolutely you
Hmm.
must have love, you have
Hmm.
love and not hate. And then he asks her about her beliefs, and she says, "My only absolute is my own private conscience.
Hmm.
I'm an individualist." And so then the means is that every one of us has our own individual conscience,
Yeah.
and so therefore it's all relative to the
Hmm.
individuals.
Yeah.
But he says, "Well, wait a second. You always believe that it's right to follow your conscience, and for me to follow my
Hmm.
conscience." And so you do have a universal ethic, not just an individual one, that we all must follow our
Hmm.
own conscience and what we think is right or wrong based upon the circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And so you really have an absolutist view too,
Yeah.
as a basis of any moral law. And that's the fundamental problem with moral relativism, is that when you really get down to it, there's going to be an absolute somewhere down there.
Hmm. Yeah.
How far down you have to go digging for it, you're going to find it
He also
eventually.
makes that point a little earlier, and I liked his point when talking about situations. When Libby says, situations are relative, and he says, yeah, they might be relative to other situations, but situations aren't subjective. Situations are objective. It's just
Yes.
the facts of what happened or what didn't happen. You don't get to say what happened or what didn't happen. You don't get to make up your own interpretation of a situation. A situation is just a situation. So he's even saying like in situational ethics, which is what a lot of people I think subscribe to now, even that's still an objective based. It has to be based on objective fact at some point because it's just what
Right.
happened in the situation and how you apply it.
Yeah, well, logically it does, but there are some I could just call them absurdists
Mhm.
that think, well, there is no real truth, or it's
Yeah,
your
well, of
truth, your
course.
truth,
Yeah.
and those are borderline insanity. There needs to be a kind of a recognition that insanity exists, and insanity is a denial of reality as it exists.
Yeah.
And I think people are reluctant to agree to that.
Yeah.
In some circumstances, like, wait a second, there's some people that are just crazy.
Yeah.
And they can understand that if it's a criminally insane person who stabs somebody saying, well, I thought I was carving a pumpkin. but they don't apply it to any other obviously dysfunctionally mental person. But event. So they did kind of get off on a little bit of a side tangent, but I almost wanted them to explore it a little bit more, where he's talking about, her one true belief, which is her conscience. And then he says, well, you're treating your conscience as God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what moral relativism is they're making themselves a God.
Yeah.
And they kind of went down that a little bit. And then he talks about, that's when we segue, I think, into the next argument.
Evolution, yeah.
The evolution that we've evolved this it's kind of like an efficient social structure of morality. It's not it's really not good or it's bad. We just as a society, in order for us to procreate and have kids that survive, we have to have some sort of moral code.
Because her argument is, well, of course I don't worship my conscience because my conscience can't have any divine nature to it. It's just something that just happened over thousands of years for utilitarian purposes, is really her argument. It's very much, it helps us, stay cohesive, helps us, build better societies. And we've just evolved this, from, the past species.
Yes. And then he does a good job of very quickly dealing with this in this fictional conversation, of course, where he says, well, are apes or other people infallible?
Mm-hmm.
And she says, of course not. Then why do you treat them if they were? How is this evolutionary morality or moral structure, ethics structure somehow beneficial? How do you know that's beneficial to the species? It's obviously not divine. And why would they know better than us? Or the society know better than the individual that what is moral or what is not moral, just on some sort of practical reality to say, well, it's better for the group or it's not better for the group. And then he does a really good job when he starts talking about, heroic or the dissenters, people that would do things that would be self-sacrificial, which doesn't make any sense evolutionary. From an evolutionary standpoint, although you can make the argument that eventually through second or third causes, it helps the species otherwise, because maybe that type of altruism will reward the group over the long run. I don't know if that's really borne out historically, especially early human history. It may have a better argument for it now, but when it was even more brutal than it is today, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to give life voluntarily as opposed to fleeing from battle and appropriating somewhere else.
Yeah, I do like what he says. Going back to a little bit to where you're talking about, why do other people have authority? If we recognize that other people make mistakes and stuff, because he kind of acknowledges you have to have some, higher truth to even make the claim that people should listen to their conscience. Because if everyone's just doing what feels right to them, then whatever. But I do like the line Libby says, the relativist, are you saying an agnostic can't respect her conscience? And he says, no, I'm saying someone who respects her conscience can't be an agnostic. So if you think that people have authority, if there's an authority in your conscience, it has to come from some higher thing, because we recognize other people do wrong very often, because they ignore their conscience or they've just done bad things and stuff like that. But I do like his point, going back to what you were talking about, the altruism and stuff. I think he mentions, or maybe I'm making this up, but maybe he mentions, or maybe this is earlier, but with like Socrates and stuff, what benefit for the species did it have for Socrates to die in the name of justice? His idea of justice and stuff like that. Well, of course, it didn't have any immediate benefits, didn't have social cohesion. The reason they killed him was because he was breaking up the society, at least in their opinions, because he's like, you're corrupting the youth, you're making us, more distant from each other, you're changing their minds away from what works. But we recognize now that Socrates was, in the right. For dying or at least saying he did no wrong there, and not just saying, oh yeah, I did it, give me the other punishment and stuff like that. But so it's like situations like that, how do you explain that in an evolutionary standpoint? How do you explain a Jesus dying to spread a truth, even though society is by all means functioning? People are procreating, there's life happening. It doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yes. Yeah, and he didn't make that argument in this chapter. But he alluded to it in the previous chapter, and it's an excellent question, though. And then you think about pacifist philosophies, which are suicidal in some circumstances. But the other thing I wanted to mention was there's this quote on 107 where Issa talks about situational ethics, but some principles aren't situational; they're universal, even as they apply to the relativists. So he says, but the principle, it says where she mentions you can't go by some people inflexible yardstick of the world. It's always changing. So she's making this argument about the things are changing. She says, yes, it is, but principles aren't. So you have to apply the same principles to different situations. The very fact that you have to take the situation into account, as you said, the very fact that you have to apply the same principles differently to different situations presupposes the validity of those principles rather than eliminating the principles or undermining them. And that's a fundamental disagreement that these two characters have, is that he's applying principles to different situations. And of course, she does too in her own way. She's trying to say, well, there's different situations, so there are no unifying principles or guiding principles, all those things. And
Because
then
the thing is, with situational ethics, you're essentially applying the situation and measuring it against, what produces the best outcome. So you already have some idea of what, the best is, what the good outcome is. And you're just saying we have to meet, that to whatever the situation is. The situation might change how that's best produced, but you're still looking for some sort of good outcome. You have an idea of what that should be, what the just outcome is.
Yeah, and this I thought was the money quote from this chapter, where he says, he's talking about that issue, and he says, it's same page, it's you relativists who yearn for absolutes, you miss them, and so you naturally idolize some relative thing. You can't condemn adultery or abortion, so you condemn smoking or guns or pollution. And boy, that's the truth. The relativists are the ones that always condemn people so much more than the religious fanatics, really. I mean, it is they have a fanaticism about them, about these other little, not even necessarily moral issues, like condemning all guns. Oh, the guns are bad. Oh, okay. Well, they can be the wrong hands, but
and again, this is 1999. But I think if this was written sometime sooner, I would definitely add at least a little bit stronger. But the climate change movement, of course, I know he alludes to pollution and stuff, but that's become just a major thing among the relativist types, where it's like you have to cut your carbon emissions, you have to do this and that and this and that, just to save, preserve the good in the world and stuff like that.
Well, it's just a matter of more people in power believing it. The relativists always had that.
Yeah.
So you go back to the creation of Earth Day and Mother Earth and Gaia and all that BS. That's been around for decades. So it was well established. It's just a matter of degree. Like the government is now pushing those things in corporate world. So the corporate world was more opposed to it, especially like the petroleum companies, which are now talking about alternative fuels and how they're going to save the world. And I'm like, why don't you just burn more oil, dummy? But anyway, or drill more oil, we'll burn it. So, but yeah, it's a good point. It's gotten even worse, so that it's so apparent that it's a moral philosophy and not a scientific one, because they don't have, they have to have, you really do have a sense that they have this sense that they need to condemn bad things. They have to have a religion. They don't call it a religion, but that's certainly becoming more and more true as you observe these people. Anyway,
there's another great quote on the next page, kind of in line with that, with talking about Jesus. Because Libby says, you sound so sure of yourself, so dogmatic, so judgmental. Your namesake, which Isa, I think I meant to mention this in episodes past, but Isa is like an Arabic form of Jesus. Like the same root name, like how we have Joshua and stuff like that, as a similar name.
I didn't catch that, yeah.
He says, your namesake said, judge not, but you don't dig into that, soft stuff, do you? And then he responds, what do you think Jesus meant when he said, judge not? Do you think he meant don't judge deeds, don't believe the commandments, don't morally discriminate a just war from an unjust war or a hero from a bully? He couldn't have meant that. He meant don't claim to judge motives and hearts, which only God can see. I can judge your deeds because I can see them. I can't judge what your motives are because I can't see that. And again, I know we've talked about this many times with, judgmental Jesus and stuff like that, but that's what a lot of people conflate is, don't, Jesus said, judge not. So don't try to apply the 10 Commandments to anything, which is a complete, nonsensical statement because of course, we're supposed to use the principles of our religion and apply them to lives, apply them to actions and stuff like that. It's not just let everyone do whatever they want, but we've talked about that many times over.
Yeah, and I really like a couple of paragraphs down from there. He mentions, she talks about, love the sinner, hate the sin, remember? And he says, that's our distinction, not yours. You say there are no objective absolutes. You reduce the sin to the sinner. yeah, objective to the subjective. So you have to either condemn sinners along with the sins or else love sins along with the sinners. And that really struck me
Hmm.
because I think that's really how they see the world.
Hmm.
They can't have that same separation that Christians have where you can say, I hate the sinner, but I mean, I hate the sinner. I love the sinner, but you hate the sin.
Hmm.
That you acknowledge everybody's a sinner. We all fail,
Hmm.
but you have to say, no, you have to stop doing that.
Hmm.
No, we can't do those things. Those are wrong. But you can still say, okay, we don't hate the sinner, but we
Yeah.
have to hate the sin. And I think on the other side of it, you see these people where they say, well, if you voted for Trump, you're evil.
Yeah.
And they and I get criticisms of Trump. I even get criticisms of the Republican Party or whatever, because you have a belief that the other party can do better. And but let's say you think that it's a sin or it's racist or whatever you want to call it to belong to that party and to pursue those goals, but they don't have a separation there. And I
Hmm.
think that really struck me because they think that the people that disagree with them are not only wrong, even morally wrong, but they
Hmm.
think they're just bad to the core and irredeemable.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, and they hate so much.
Hmm. Well,
Um,
I think they have a huge problem with, I think just branding people, I think is really what it is. Like you did this thing that brands you in this category, you're irredeemable, you have to belong to this horrible, horrible group of people, and there's nothing you can do to come back from that. And that's what I see, especially. I mean, I think there's some of that on the right too, but I think a lot of it is on the left, where it's just you have to subscribe to these core beliefs and values. If you don't believe in this thing, then you are branded as, it's like a leper. You're unclean. You have to proclaim that this person should not be allowed here. This person should not be allowed to do anything with us. Kick them out, ostracize them, stuff like that. Just crazy.
and you're seeing that a lot with people that are kind of open their eyes to the populist
Hmm.
sentiment on the right that really mirrors a lot of the populist sentiment on the left.
Hmm.
And like especially like the immigration issues, it's people are like, wait a second, they're trying to the political apparatus is trying to throw them out of the party, and then the censorship, the First Amendment stuff. So you see some of these left wing reporters who are actually true to their ideals, and they're getting ostracized
Hmm.
from the club, and it's because it's like sinner.
Yeah.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers when he's not one of us, or what was it? There was a Star Trek episode of, oh yeah, One of the Body.
Mm.
The old Star Trek. That's a really spooky, prescient story about a computer that
Hmm.
runs the world and controls all sorts of. It's actually a precursor to the Purge movies.
Oh,
But so I forget what the episode is called, but
interesting.
there's nothing that the Star Trek hasn't addressed either in
Hmm.
the original series or the next generation.
Oh, there you
The
go.
other ones, not so much. Anyway, so where was I? Oh yeah, so the
Yeah.
next argument is
The
the
big
David
long
Hume
one. Yeah.
the very more esoteric argument
Hmm.
than the others, which is the David Hume argument that you can primarily everything that is real is observable,
Hmm.
and so there is no moral code beyond what you can measure,
Hmm.
and so he does address that. And I don't know, this empiricism
Yeah.
philosophy but the
Because
counter argument to it Isa makes is well, because the idea is, the argument ends up being proposed to Issa is that, well, here's, you don't really know that murder is wrong, but if you see a murderer, you're just sensing that it's wrong. You have this
yeah.
feeling of evil.
Yeah, because the argument is that because everything's observable, morality has to be dependent on what we observe, and so really we're just feeling values. It's that emotive theory of values. What we believe is right or wrong is depending on our feelings. Because she says, earlier, philosophers said that that deed is a terrible deed, but if we wanted to be literal, we should say I feel terrible when I see that deed. So it's not an
Yeah.
actual moral judgment. It's just a judgment based on our value or based on our feelings towards whatever happened. And then we build our values off of that. It starts with our emotions, starts with our feelings, and then we project that outwards. And it's not like an actual code of ethics.
And I think the Issa character did a decent job of addressing that. Not, I don't know how great it was, but in essence, that well, you know, the feelings you have are not really, you don't feel that the same evil as a murderer would be.
Hmm.
You just feel it's repellent,
Hmm.
but you're also not really observing those things. It's a creation of the mind and a creation of your conscience, and you're reacting to something that is morally repugnant intellectually. And so it's not all empirical. It's
Hmm.
something internal, and there's a
Yeah.
conscience or some sort of mind that can't be measured. And then he goes through some, thought experiments with her
Hmm.
about, well, how tall are you? And she gives a specific measurement, and he says, well, is that you or just your body? And she, well, her body. And then, okay, well, how your conscious, your self-consciousness, how big is that?
Hmm.
Well, how big is your mind?
Yeah.
How do you measure
Hmm.
that? And so that's the real weaknesses of empiricism, is this mind body interaction, and this consciousness, this
Yeah.
ability to reason outside of just being, what does
Hmm.
he call it, a tape recorder? I forget what he talked, or a camera or something.
Yeah.
Like you're just inputting data. Well, that's
Mhm.
not really what we're doing. There's something more to it.
Yeah, because I like the point he
What do you
makes
think?
too about knowledge, and at some point, I think an argument can be that, well, it's just semantics and stuff. But he points out, knowledge. So if empiricism is based on knowledge of things, knowledge of what's happening, well, how do we know what knowledge is?
Yes.
Knowledge is only perception. Well, what color is knowledge, or the act of perception? What senses do we use to sense the act of sensing? So it's
Yeah.
like what you're saying. How do we make that connection between what we're seeing and like what we know in our minds? It's like when we see something, how is that information transmitted and stuff like that, where it's like, how do we know that this is the knowledge that we have? How are we interpreting these things? It's this
Right.
internal process that isn't based on outside observable data.
Yes. And it's like it's not just a physical reaction.
Hmm.
There's some sort of mental reaction, and how do you understand feeling guilty for something? That no one else knows about. Kind of like I think I maybe mentioned last episode, the question of, well, if you could steal something and no one ever know about it, would you do it?
Yeah.
Well, where's the moral code in that?
Hmm.
Is there a feeling that you would feel guilty for stealing something? Well, nobody would ever know, and they wouldn't miss it. They'd just write
Hmm.
it off or whatever. And then how does that even that's there's no empiricism to that. There's no only you would know, or God, but I guess you'd think that there is no God. I don't know. But
Hmm.
then they move on to scientism, which is a step further from empiricism, which talks about proving things through the scientific method.
Hmm.
The scientific method, her argument is, was really the scientific method has worked to give us this knowledge. This whole
Hmm.
idea of how do you know what you know, and isn't that really just a physical aspect of humanity? And so there's a kind of fairly long um, discussion of this. And that's where he says on page 113, it's that whole philosophy is inhuman. It reduces humans to cameras,
Hmm.
where he says, just as we just see the beauty of the stars with our inner eye and see the light of the stars with our outer eye, or we see the trustworthiness of a good friend with an inner eye and the shape of his body with our outer eye. So he's giving examples of how we perceive things, and we can make judgments about
Hmm.
things that are above and beyond
Hmm.
of just visualizing them,
Yeah.
or just with our five senses, being able to understand them.
Hmm.
It's not really what we do.
Yeah.
And really, I think even other higher animals, I
Hmm.
mean, even dogs kind of have a sense
Yeah.
sometimes, I think,
Hmm.
that's beyond um, just observing things.
Hmm.
Uh,
Well, I
I,
like his
I
last.
I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
I gave treats to our three dogs,
Hmm.
those big long chew sticks.
Oh yeah.
So I broke one into three, and handed one to each dog, and they ran into separate rooms.
Yes.
Well, Archie, the gentle giant, sat in one room and kind of gnawed on it a little bit, looked
Mhm.
around nervously, and eventually he stepped away from it. And guess which one took it from him after she
Violet.
completed her own?
Yes.
And then I had to take it from her, and she kind of skulked away. She knew it was like in a weird way. Even a dog knows when they've done something wrong.
Well, I also
She's
like his,
not protest.
yeah, I like his last example too, where he says, we know the triviality of a paperclip, but we feel something different when we see a great work of art. And so it's the
Yeah.
same process. We're both seeing things, we're perceiving the color and the shape and everything, but something in us tells us that this is more important, has more, value maybe, it has more importance for humanity. It's just a better thing overall, and that's not something that can really be explained by the senses.
Yes. And I think if I remember correctly, I think the last argument is this evolutionary, isn't the evolutionary one the final
Yeah.
one? And he does a good little short synopsis on 117 where he says, your theory is that morality is explainable as an instrument for biological survival, right? The tribe that stopped bashing each other on the head survived, and those that didn't stop killed each other. And so we descended from the successful tribes that practice morality and cooperation and altruism. Is that it? She's like, yes. So that's what we were alluding to
Yeah.
earlier, which is kind of parallel to the previous arguments.
Hmm.
But then he kind of explores that and says, well, what you're really saying is that whatever is necessary for the survival of the group ought to be done.
Hmm.
So there's a moral element to that assumption that there is some goal or some value to that has been
Hmm.
established prior to it benefiting the group.
Hmm.
But I think um, his real example is, and a refutation of that is that there are some things that people do that are morally just for their conscience that are contrary to this evolutionary benefit. And
Hmm.
and if you think about it logically, it would make a lot more sense to be more and more utilitarian for maximizing the number of children, that you could produce
Hmm.
on Earth, you know, and you wouldn't focus on happiness as a society. You wouldn't focus on individual happiness at all.
Yeah.
It would just be maximizing the conquest of the Earth and the stars, and just expansion. It'd be like the Borg,
Hmm.
another Star Trek reference, be one with the Borg and just keep
Yeah.
expanding and using resources
Hmm.
and adapting them. But
I do like his line of reasoning too, where she's essentially saying like morality is just like another animal instinct, right?
yes,
It's kind of what you were talking about, but I like the way that he lays it out.
I
He
like that
says,
she brought that up. I thought
mhm,
that's a good point. It could just be an
mhm,
animal instinct that we just feel and that we've evolved or,
mhm.
or or developed over time. Go ahead.
Yeah. But he says, I want to show that we don't experience morality as we experience any instinct. He says, instincts and desires push us from within, from our own nature, but morality pulls us from without, from something outside of us. And he goes on and he gets her to agree that sometimes it's good to not listen to our instincts. Sometimes we have an instinct to just do whatever, feels the best in the moment. We know that's logically not a good decision. And so therefore, sometimes it's good to obey or to not obey our instincts, but we know it's never good to disobey morality. Morality has to come from something outside, right? If all of our other instincts can be ignored, can be disobeyed, except for this one weird moral instinct, which we always should obey, which always ought to obey, that it can't just be something that is within us that we've just developed over time, like any other instinct. It has to be something exterior to us. And I like that line of reasoning. I think that holds up.
And I think I don't think a moral relativist can win this argument if the moral relativist believes that there is some sort of universal, even an individual universal code of conduct.
Hmm.
The argument against moral absolutism is much stronger for an atheist
Yeah.
than an agnostic that has a conscience.
Hmm.
But a moral relativist uh, does have a true moral relativist has some belief that there is a moral code.
Hmm.
It's a relativist code. And so I always have this kind of yearning little thing in the back of my mind about, well, this wouldn't work on an atheist, you know,
Hmm.
this wouldn't work on a somebody who believes in hard determinism, that
Hmm.
we're all just determined by physical forces to do whatever we do, and does not acknowledge
Hmm.
any morality. I think that would be a harder argument for Issa to make.
But do you
Uh,
think people like that actually exist? Like I know there's people who claim that they think that, but I think you'd be very hard pressed to find someone that doesn't believe that there's any moral right or wrong.
they exist. They're sociopaths.
No, yeah, that's true, I guess.
They do exist, and then but the vast majority of people that articulate it are cheap um uh moral preeners, like
Mm,
they're if you do find somebody that is an atheist who believes in hard determinism, they don't, when you really dwell down to it, you can usually catch them, and they will, you will find out that they are dishonest.
hmm.
What do they care, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
But because I think humans are, but their counter argument to that would be, well, I'm hardwired to believe that I have free will.
Yeah.
And so that's always their get out of logic
Hmm.
card on the morality hard determinism
Yeah.
thing. They'll always say, well, I only feel that way, or I think that way because that's how I've evolved as
Hmm.
this creature, like a beetle, like a dung beetle pushing a piece of poop along the desert floor or whatever. Doesn't really understand, whether that's good or bad. It's just what
Yeah.
they do, and we're just more complex, and so we seem like we're just supercomputers,
Hmm.
and we're just um, ones and zeros,
Hmm.
but we're just a whole hell of a lot more of them. And so, but I think logically it's harder to argue these things. But you're right.
Yeah.
They don't really exist.
Hmm.
They don't in their day-to-day lives really
Hmm.
believe that everything's
Yeah.
determined, because they're making choices.
Yeah.
They're saying,
Because
well, should I get a
it's.
coffee mocha something something from Starbucks, or should I get the decaf latte such and such? They at least perceive that they have
Hmm.
choices. They
Yeah.
act as if they have choices. They don't just let the fates
Yeah.
decide. And
I feel like, those type of people are really just kind of, because they're not really arguing a point, right? A lot of the times. It's just like, well, the rules just don't apply to me. It's like what you're saying. It's like a get out logic free. It's like saying, well, surely you feel this way about this and such and such. And they just say, no, no, I don't. I
yeah,
feel like that's what a lot of it is. It's like, no, I don't. You can't prove it. And it's like, well,
right.
that's you're not actually, logicking your way through this. You're just saying, well, no, I just disagree. And it's like you're not actually working to anything. So I don't feel that way. It's like, okay, well, thanks. This has been a great discussion.
Yeah, but when it back to the previous point is, once a moral relativist says that there's a belief in a moral, that there is a conscience and we should all follow our conscience, all things are lost in that
Yeah.
argument. The
Mhm.
moral relativist argument will eventually fail, no matter how many arguments you make in favor of it. It's just not. They don't even believe it.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to, is that we are all moral absolutists. It's just some people want to excuse bad behavior.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's really what it comes down to.
Mhm.
I don't want to be blamed.
Yeah.
Uh, so how about I get it's really dispensation. It's really a modern form of indulgences.
Mhm.
And the dispensations, they get dispensations for being anti-racist, or they get
Yeah.
dispensations for bringing their cloth bags to Walmart or the grocery store,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have their own indulgences that they pay the price for that moral superiority. I was at the symphony over the
Oh,
weekend. Carmina Burana, what great St. Louis Symphony
yeah.
Orchestra, fantastic performance. And I saw a couple of those people that I detest wearing masks. I'm
Yes.
like, you are in there, but thankfully less than 10
Oh,
and the entire crowd. So it's the fever is almost completely broken, but that's a form of, indulgences. No, I'm better than other people because I care more about it because I'm wearing a mask or whatever.
yeah.
Anyway, so I just thought I'd mention that.
Yes. No, that's a good, good point to throw in there. But no, I agree. I think a lot of it is. I think we're kind of wrapping up here, unless you have any other
Yes.
thoughts about the book itself. But no,
Nope.
I think I agree with you. Is that a lot of it is just it's exactly what you're saying. It's a form of absolutism, with the absolutes being these key measures that show that you're really a relativist. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I'm of course I'm a good person by our absolute standards because, I wear the little, pride flag, which means that I respect everybody's choice to do whatever they want. It's like, so you
Right.
have to absolutely affirm, the I it's like an absolute affirmation of saying that I want everyone to do whatever they want.
Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
it's like just this weird sort of loop of, well, there's an absolute behind it, but you're just saying you want everyone to do exactly what they want and be whoever they are with no, moral, code. But the moral code is affirming exactly that.
Yeah, and what's so funny about that is if somebody like me were to join there, and I'd say, yeah, I'm heterosexual in a committed relationship, and I think all the rest of the things you people do is gross. They would condemn me. Wait, what?
Yes.
But that's my view. I think you were gross. I think you were disgusting. Uh, you know, you're you're repugnant. Why can't I have that belief? Why can't I be part of the Rainbow Coalition? I'm one of the colors of the flag. I don't know, but that's what I'll do later. I'll join some sort of rainbow group and
there you go.
hostile to them and insult them. I don't know. That'll be the Christian view, I think.
I think that's a retirement plan, maybe. That's because you won't be able to get a job after that. That's for sure. Oh my gosh.
I don't know. I think it's changing. I think the world,
we'll see. We'll see.
Feel it moving underneath my feet.
That's good. That's good.
The swell. It's like right before the tsunami. It's like the ocean just slowly pulls away, and you're like, wait a second, what's happening with the shoreline? Whoosh. I'm cautiously optimistic that
there you go.
The tsunami is coming.
That's good. I'm glad. I'm glad. Do you have any other?
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, do you have any other final thoughts? But it seemed like you were about to throw something else in there.
Nah.
All right. Well, this has been season 7, episode 7 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.
And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.